Okay, thank you very much, everybody. I think we've just about got everybody back. So if I was to summarise this morning, I think we had a lot of great discussions and presentations, very much themed around how we share understanding of the drivers' risks and issues to build a consensus around how best to use data to better deliver public services and commercial services while protecting citizen privacy, which I will admit to stealing completely shamelessly from our next speaker's biography. So I think there's a really great link into our next speaker, and I'd like to welcome to the stage Peter Lawrence-Aubier, who is the Deputy Director of the Government Innovation Group within the Cabinet Office, and is going to talk to us about using data in government, a view from the Cabinet Office. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. Welcome. I'm Pete Lawrence. I'm leading work in Cabinet Office to try and understand how government can best use data to deliver public services. I'm planning to give you an overview of the work we've done to date and just let you know where we're off to. So can using data create social and economic benefit? Good question. And that's really what I'm trying to answer to shape the work we're now doing. As it says here, government has to act more smartly, and one of the ways we can do that is by using the information that's already held in government more effectively. At the moment, people, of course, think that government can use the data it collects as it wants. Most citizens don't understand the barriers that exist between the different departments, and even within departments, the different reasons that you provided data can limit the use of that data very significantly. And there are, of course, in places like HMRC and DWP, very strong sanctions on individuals if they erroneously share that data either inside or outside of the organisation. And it's so serious that they can be sent to prison for it. So that does focus where people are thinking about that sort of data. But if we could use this data more effectively, there will be financial savings in administration, but intelligent use of that data that we already hold means that we can offer the right services to the right person at the right time. And it's important that we offer that. This is not about doing to citizens, and that's one of the messages we need to get through as part of this work and this thinking, is that we're talking about offering people services or benefits that they can choose to take up or not in most cases. So it's not always easy. There is this term, a patchwork quilt. So data sharing is described like that because there are a whole range of statutory permissions within government for using data. There are common law powers, and equally as important, there are prohibitions. Now, because of all these different approaches, what we're finding is gradually the common law powers, if we're not careful, will be eroded to the point that government will only be able to use data where it has a permission or where there is absolutely no prohibition, rather than just thinking about common law. So it's quite important that we think about how we use data going forward and get some legislation where necessary to provide us greater freedom. So all of those points that I've talked about really can lead to this risk aversion in government when handling data. People are not sure whether they can use it, whether they can share it, and what will happen to them if they do. So this piece of work I'm leading on is focusing on three things. So first, it's about being able to better understand the UK's economy and society. From whether it's more accurate measures of GDP, understanding lack of social mobility, so what is failing to drive social mobility. At the same time, we want to try and move away, as I think you may have heard this morning, but I wasn't here, from the traditional census. Government have a view on that, and so some of this work may enable better use of data to support that ambition. Secondly, improving prevention and identification of fraud. So how can we identify and stop fraud and save all that money on the public purse. Apparently costs, around 30 billion a year, lost in fraud. Now, some people would say that's in a tolerable level percentage-wise, but actually when, we're in such dire straits financially, 30 billion pounds is a lot of money. And so we need to think about, how we can best reduce that. And on the sort of fraud, error and debt piece, we also want to try and help citizens who've got multiple debts with government to consolidate those debts. At the moment, if you've got, a debt as a citizen to HMRC, a debt to the court service, a debt to DWP, those debts are dealt with individually. You usually can't aggregate them, and so therefore, you have three relationships with one citizen on debt, and if they've got three £10 debts a week, as it were, and they've only got £20, chances are they'll pay none of them, and so that massively increases stress levels. And there's a very strong link between debt and mental health levels. And so the focus of our work on the debt is not about recovering the money, it's about removing the stress and improving the situation for people. And the consequence of that is we're likely to actually recover more money. But the focus is on the individual. And finally, it's about improving the tailoring of public services. So using data to be able to deliver the right services to the right person at the right time. And that will help tackle a whole range of issues from social mobility through to anything else affecting the vulnerable in society, through to things that we don't yet know. And so we do need to think about, as we go forward, how we future-proof our work. So what we're not interested in doing in this work, we're not interested in collecting more data or building large databases. Generally, the press would look at the work we're doing in this sort of space, and they go, oh, right, government's trying to collect more data, and it's going to build a big database, and it's going to hold all of this data. That's not the intention. And these days, with technological advances, that's not necessarily the way to do it. You don't need to do that. You can just pull together the right data that you need at the right time, use it, and release it again. So, and that's what I was saying. At the moment, citizens already assume that we are using their data in different ways. We don't want indiscriminate use of data. We're talking about controlled use of data within certain conditions, certain environments. We're not talking about general powers for anybody in the public sector to get data or to request data from other parts of the public sector and use it. There will be some instances of that. So linked to example for the statistical work in ONS, it's important that they can get as much data from other departments as possible, but they can, of course, only use that data for very specific purposes as defined in the statute that set them up. And we're not looking to weaken the DPA. Again, people will report that we're trying to undermine the Data Protection Act or to weaken that. We're not trying to do that at all. We recognise that the DPA and the HRA are there for the safeguarding of citizens, and we're not looking to change that proposition at all. And the government are clearly aligned to those things. So my Minister, Francis Maude, is strongly aligned to those statements and regularly makes them. So what are we doing now? And okay, this is the wrong words on this slide. Heading's right, but the words are wrong. So just ignore the slide. So we began this work in June 2013 to try and provide some policy and legislative change solutions to the three problem areas I've talked about. So we've looked at how the law currently does and doesn't work on data sharing. We've talked to people across the public sector and understood about the legal gateway problems that exist. We've explored a range of potential solutions and thinking about how we might implement them. What would that look like in legislation? And so that work sort of took place over the summer of last year through to the autumn, at which point traditionally, although there'd been some engagement more broadly, Cabinet Office would probably have written out through the Minister to other departments to get collective agreement to take something forward. But this is such a contentious area, and I'm sure you're all aware of that, the use of data in government like this is massively contentious. And so we've agreed with the Minister that we go down a completely different route on this in this time. And we'll engage people from outside government to actually help us develop the policy proposals to take this forward. Government has not made up its mind about what the policy on data sharing should be. Civil servants, haven't provided any formal advice on this yet, and so this is still very early work in the process, as it were, in terms of civil service advising government. There's no foregone conclusion. And the Minister for Cabinet Office, Francis Maude, has been very clear that unless we can develop sufficient consensus both within and outside of government on this, then the work is unlikely to go forward to a bill or anything in Parliament. So it's quite an interesting position and not one we're used to. So we may not be able to reach consensus on everything, but that's until we get to that point, we don't know where we'll go next. We've done some initial work with an open policy group with these sort of bodies listed on the screen here. And so around the table we've had departments at the same time as we've had people from Big Brother Watch, Open Rights Group, No to ID, talking about the issues from both sides and working closely together and trying to bring the perspectives more closely together. And actually, I think what we found is, it is working just for those in government to understand the drivers of some of the privacy concerns, firsthand from a proper perspective and through case study examples as people are talking through, it is really helping us to think through what the problems are. At the same time, those from outside government are seeing that actually, data use in government is well managed, is well controlled, it's done properly, and there's a lot of integrity in the system. Previously, they may have thought we were a bunch of charlatans in terms of how we get the data and then use it, and those positions are changing, and that's what's helping for us to start to come together and start to get a balance in this process. So we're looking at the evidence jointly, in some cases, and I'll touch on this a bit later, where evidence is insufficient. We're collecting more evidence. We're trying to find ways to get the evidence that people are asking for, and that is evidence requests from both inside and outside government. So other departments are saying to one another, actually, I'm not sure about that. How can you justify what it is you're saying? Where's your evidence here? And so we're seeking from the outset to make sure that all the voices are heard, rather than going through a whole lot of work and get to the traditional sort of end state of getting ready to introduce a bill to Parliament, and then having heavy critique from outside, and people saying, oh no, you can't do that, or this is wrong, or that's wrong. So what we want to do is to start from a higher position before we start a much broader public engagement piece. We've asked a company called Involve to facilitate the process with us. They're a not-for-profit organisation who support democratic engagement, and so they're working with us as a facilitator and convener of the people from outside government. So as I was saying earlier about research and statistics, so this is about making it easier for public authorities to provide information to ONS. It's for data that's had identifiers removed through trusted third parties to link that data, provide it in safe settings for researchers inside and outside of government. So this is data in a sandbox, been through a trusted third party indexing process. Researcher can go in, undertake a project, take away some results, but not take away any data. The data is then dumped back out of the system. And specifically for Revenue and Customs, to provide an ability for them to provide de-identified information in safe settings for public benefit. At the moment, HMRC are working on a slightly unlevel playing field where they can't have the same equality as other parts of the public sector in terms of ability to share data in these conditions. So we're trying to remove that condition through this and make that easier. And of course, a lot of their data will help provide a lot of answers to some of the social problems. So that's the driver for that. Fraud, error and debt, as I was saying, from the 73 billion of fraud, there's 20 billion attributable to public sector. And we think that we can save big chunks of money for the economy through better use of data to prevent fraud. So these figures are representative, and this is one of the areas where we've had a lot of pushback on the evidence base, and so more work will be undertaken to pilot and test a number of cases here, so that we can see both what the real scale of the loss is, and through testing, actually look at the benefit of the interventions, because that's the other thing that we're having lots of debate about in our work is, so how do we know the intervention is going to work? And if we're going to legislate for work around this area, we want to make sure that we're doing the right thing and we're covering the right areas. Management of debt owed by citizens, again, as I was saying, mostly uncoordinated, ineffective, bureaucratic, and we want to make that better and reduce stress on citizens. Tailoring public services, so offering the services at the right time. Public agencies need support to be able to do this, and and that's not just central departments. Lots of public services now delivered through local authorities, and so it's about how do we make sure that the right people can get access to the right data, but balancing the two key issues of privacy and public service delivery. It's very difficult to get the balance where you can maximise the privacy and maximise the public service delivery, but that's the focus of our work. Yeah, and we do need, as I was saying earlier, this is where we need to future-proof here particularly, because when we started this piece of work, it was focused on trying to establish legal powers for particular use cases. So a power to share data to try and improve the situation of what's called troubled families. A power to help with warm home energy payments. So how could you, through data, automatic make payments to the most vulnerable on energy fronts? But actually that's all well and good. But if post the next election, somebody, whichever administration is in power, chances are there'll be new ministers in departments. There usually are reshuffles and things. Somebody may have a different view and say, I don't like the term troubled families. And so, if we've legislated for a particular thing, you have to be careful and make sure you're doing the right thing. So we thought about how we can describe what it is we're trying to achieve in a different way. And so we're at a place at the moment, and conversations are still continuing, because this is one of the areas where there is quite a lot of conversation, particularly with the privacy lobby, about how far can you go with a power for it to be flexible, to future-proof, without it being an all-encompassing power. So at the moment we're trying to think about how we could define policy objectives around which data sharing could be approved. And so whether that's an objective around improving the health, education, employment for households with multiple public service dependency, whether that type of description in a schedule to legislation would be, sufficient for public services to do what they're trying to do, and would it be sufficient for those outside government to secure the privacy issue. And then if it's, going forward, you'd have a schedule that was amendable so that as new and unknown social policy issues arise, we are able to actually look and deal with them. And it's quite important that we need to think about how we use these things. So there are some issues and risks linked to this. And so one of the things is sort of individual conflict that people have based on their own situation. People's views can change very quickly. So just put your hand up. Do you think it's a good idea for government to share data to prevent fraud? Put your hand up. Okay, most people. Are you happy for your data to be included in a data set initially to help government identify those people that might be perpetrating fraud? Put your hands up. Okay, I'm not surprised because you're probably a slightly more informed in audience to a number of the people we talk to. But generally, you'd get a lot of hands for the first question, but many fewer from those that are uninformed about data for the second. Similarly, let's try with the health. So if you would prefer all parts of the health and social care system to have access to your real-time healthcare record, put your hand up. Oh, far fewer, actually. And who would be happy for such a record to be available to pharmaceutical companies for research? Similar people, okay. But there's still quite a lot of people that aren't content. And so that sort of demonstrates that, depending on the issue that we're talking about, particularly, people's views on whether government should or should not share data change massively. And on the health question, usually if you've got people that have recently had need to use the health service or relatives recently used the health service, their propensity to say, yes, this is a good idea, tends to be much stronger. Now, how long that lasts for before they read other things and they forget the benefit that they've received and therefore and data sharing then becomes a bad idea, I don't know. But it's one of those things. So there is that individual conflict that we're struggling with, and of course that exists both within citizens we trying to serve, through the people in the public services that try and do the delivery, and in this case, importantly, those who are actually in Parliament making the final decision on this. And people can be quite easily swayed and persuaded, usually more strongly by the risks attached to it rather than the benefits, is some of the experience we've seen in this piece. So trust. So there's been quite a lot on trust recently. RSS produced their survey quite recently. I know other organisations are doing some work on trust around data. But generally, people don't really trust the government and those of us that work for the government of the day delivering their services. And so we need to think about how we can build and develop that trust. There's issues around delivery of public services. As more is delivered more remotely from government, either through charities or, in some cases, private sector deliverers, people have different views about the use of data in those different scenarios. And so that's all impacting. We need to think about how we get through that. If it's a charity, people would see a charity generally as more acceptable than a private sector company. Although in reality, what's the difference between those two organisations? They're not part of government. They are separate. So developing proposals that deal with longevity is tricky. As I was saying, we don't know what's coming up next. Will public attitudes to data change going forward? As technology changes, the amount of apps available, the amount of data people provide at the moment, and if it does change, which way will it go? Will people, start to pull back from data use and the sharing of the data? Will it be too late for people to change their views on data in some cases? And so we need to think about all of these things and covering that off where we are with this. So there are opportunities to sharing data, but we need to understand what the issues and risks are. So you'll notice I've not talked about data sharing because we're not talking about data sharing, because I think data sharing generally is a very broad term that covers a range of things. So we're talking about data use or how data is used in government. And so that, oh, it's disappeared. So the top of the slide here, this scale, we're starting to think about data in different ways. So there's a scale obviously from closed to open, and we're just thinking about what are the other points on that line that we think about. And so we're saying actually, the default position should be using minimum data necessary to complete the task or transaction for delivery of public service or benefit. So what does that mean? It means, well, if you've got the data in your department that you can use to do that, and just closed data, you need nothing else, that's fine. If you need to check something with another department, and this is where perhaps with the private sector delivery, if somebody can just do a validation that says, does this person qualify, yes or no? And so you just get back a binary response through the IT system that says, yeah, this is fine. So if someone's delivering motability vehicles, for example, there are a number of benefits that qualify an individual to receive a motability support vehicle, and motability people could just go, does this person qualify, yes or no? If it comes back yes, all they know is they've qualified, not why or which benefit, which is a much more acceptable route to go down. Stuff around data matching, so instead of people providing their data constantly and providing the same data, it's the typical sort of postcode type thing where you put your postcode in, click get my address, and it just automatically fills the rest of the field. Government should think about doing that much more. So if you provide your national insurance number or some other reference, by consent, somebody can click a button and say, the other field I can see on the screen, get the data and fill them in for me. And then there's the data analysis piece, which is about what people would probably traditionally call data sharing. So it's about pulling together disparate data sets or pieces of data for some analytical purposes. And then there's the open data at the other end, which is there for people to use as they will. And so then there's this bit at the bottom about trust over on the left-hand side there, so building trust. And as I was saying, this is difficult, particularly where government's concerned. And so what we've discovered through talking to people is about actually, if we can demonstrate what it is we're trying to do by example, if we've got evidence, and that may mean, you may start with the evidence and then demonstrate use by example, or you may demonstrate use by example, which will help you gather better evidence. And if you go at the right pace and don't try to push things through or rush things, just make sure you're considered, you're more likely to build trust with those outside of government and those inside government, because it's not always the case that people willingly share data even within government. And so it's, there are those three steps there to building trust, which I don't see as happening in any particular order. You just need to do the right thing, so it's not cyclic in that respect. So where have we got to in this work so far? So we're just about to produce an interims findings document that will be made publicly available. That will be agreed with all the stakeholders involved, and it will show where we've got to in each of the three areas and where the points of contention or further conversation lie. We'll then agree from that where we go next. As I was saying, I think the next step will be further conversations over the next couple of months through to the end of the year, where we'll look at much more of the implementation. So we've got some high-level proposals and principles about how data could be used within government, but to build the consensus further in a way that we think would support the government introducing legislation into the House of Parliament that has a good chance of success of getting through without, being completely vetoed or without major change is to continue the conversations that we've been having and to look at the implementation detail. So, and that's where the questions have got to. So, for example, we're thinking about how do you manage accreditation processes for people to access the data. So we're saying, at this stage, we're saying, well, there'll be an accreditation process, and people won't be able to access the research data unless they're accredited, unless the research has been accredited. And so the questions we've now got to address and take through are, well, who will do this accreditation? Where will it sit? What sort of makeup would a body like it have? What sort of things would it consider? And so by going through those sort of questions, we'll be able to better draft some legislation that covers much more. One of the other steps is now about broadening the engagement on this project. So partly hence my coming to talk to you today is to start to engage more broadly those outside of the community that we've been currently talking to and get a broader view. Because there is a big question that we haven't really yet touched on, which is about, well, what about the use of data held by the private sector, for use in government, and how will citizens feel about that? How will government feel about that? How will those in the private sector or charity sector feel about that? And what are the issues that we need to cover? So today it's you that I'm interested in hearing views on, and I think I fall in front of a workshop session that you're about to have on this sort of question. So I'm really interested to see what comes out of that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So just before we go to the workshops, does anybody have any questions for Peter?
Hello there. Simon Lavender from Marks & Spencer. Peter, DNA has been captured on the general public, and at the moment I think we're only capturing that on criminals. However, I think there could be fast medical breakthroughs in place if we could actually work together and achieve some social and economic benefits. In relation to this, I was wondering what your thoughts are and how we can reduce the suffering to those suffering from genetic conditions.
So generally the health data is outside mainly the scope of this work. There is a specific project on genomics in Department of Health where they are trying to capture the DNA of 100,000 people for improved research. So that's not really a question I can answer other than that, but it's an issue probably for Department of Health directly, I'm afraid.
Thank you. Hello, Glenn Watson from ONS. Thank you, Peter. Really interesting presentation. I enjoyed your little exercise demonstrating our different attitudes depending on what the subject is, and I think that's right. My suspicion, people would say that I would say this, my suspicion is that the least contentious is providing and sharing data for statistics, official statistics purposes. But I wondered whether you could comment on whether you think the legislation, if we get to that point, would be more or less successful more or less likely, by combining the three strands you've talked about rather than separating them out. My concern is that all three together perhaps increases the chance of it failing, although you could argue it the other way as well, I see.
Yeah. I understand where you're coming from. We had a conversation at the outset about, whether any of this work could go forward on a faster timescale separately, and we decided that wasn't really the case. And partly the research and statistics ability, you can think about it in sort of the three segments. So if you do the research and statistics work in whatever way we can, and you can identify from that possible solution to a social problem, what you want to be able to do is to then implement such a solution through the tailored public service strand that we're doing. So it's about understanding, so what are the parameters of this, how can we solve this, and then identifying where you might offer a new service or existing service to improve that situation. And then you sort of go into a review phase, which would also encompass to some extent the fraud activity in terms of making sure that the right people are getting the benefit or service when they're supposed to, and payments are being made correctly or deliveries being done in the right place. And so that's one way of thinking about it. The other way of thinking about it is data sharing. Because of the contention of the matter, there's probably just one shot in Parliament to get something through, is my view. And if you separate it out, you've probably got to take a conscious decision that says, we'll take this forward, but whichever piece is left out probably for 8 years to a decade. And so it's about whether that's tolerable. But it is a decision we'll have to take when we get to the end of our current consultation process, which is not a broad public consultation. It's open to anyone that's interested, but it is it's not a broad public consultation at this point. But that will follow before we go to legislation if we get to that point. But yeah, we will take a decision on what there's consensus on, what there isn't, and is it worth going ahead with just elements.
Martin Bellingham from AXA. You talked about 30 billion in fraud as a small part of size of the prize. Have you got an idea about what the total size of the prize could be to maybe motivate people to actually get this moving forward?
No, and that's one of the areas where the evidence has been strongly questioned, and we in some parts, in terms of what's being delivered by government, we have been wanting in that evidence base, and so there are some suggested tests and pilots to try and understand what really is the scale of the issue, and therefore we've got a better idea of how good our extrapolation is at the moment around the numbers.
Have you got any idea about sort of almost ballpark figures of the size of the prize?
No, I don't, and I'm going to have to be politician type now and go, no, I can't answer that question because I generally don't know the answer to that. I don't know if my colleague at the back knows the answer to that. Paul? No, he doesn't know. That's fine. Sorry.
The second term.
Alistair Calder from ONS. Is ONS allowed another question? Is that right? It's to do with this public debate and the public consultation part of this. So one of John's 6 things we need to do next earlier on was to engage the public. Your third step there, make findings publicly available. Is that a public debate? Is that a public discussion? Are we likely to have an open public discussion about this, do you think, in the next couple of years?
Oh, yeah. I think we would. So our next step is, to make publicly available the interim findings of the group so far that will, be agreed by all of those involved in the process. It's not a government document. It's not a statement of government policy. It is just a report collectively of where we've got to. Everything that we've done so far is publicly available. There's a website entitled www.datasharing.org.uk. It's important to put the .uk on the end or you'll get to some other random site that asks you to donate your data. So on there, it's got details of where we started, where we've got to. The document will be available there in a couple of weeks. And say from that we'll decide again collectively as a group whether we continue the conversations. I don't know whether there's sufficient appetite from those outside government yet to continue those conversations and to look at the implementation detail, and I wouldn't want to second guess them on that. But once we, when we reach the end of a process where we have, so I say, got some consensus, that's the point at which we'll take a view on, whether we do a white paper or whether it's just a draft bill that goes to parliamentary scrutiny or you know, whether it's white paper followed by draft bill, or whether it's a white paper that includes a draft bill. And so those decisions will be taken. Like I say, our next review point will be Christmas. But I think, yeah, if we get to a place where we go ahead, then I would suggest that, you know, within the next 2 years, which is your time frame, would be a strong possibility.
I think we've time for just one more question, if there's another one. No, in which case, thank you very much once again.